and welcome to another smashing episode from the Middle Road. Today, I welcome Dr. Helene Clark. In today's podcast, I chat with a leading global expert and social change maker within the international development sector. This is Nishant Malhotra, the sole founder of the Middle Road platform, a thought leader in enabling social change and impact within the global ecosystem. It's basically a fusion of media and edtech, and do log into www.themiddleroad.org. First, a brief introduction. Dr. Helene Clark is the founder and director of Acknowledge and board chair of the Center for Theory of Change, a global thought leader in enabling social change and impact within the social impact sector. Acknowledge is a social enterprise that connects social change practice with rigorous study of how and why initiatives work. Acknowledge is the founder of Center of Theory of Change, a nonprofit focusing on outcome-driven interventions, and we'll look at what we mean by interventions. It's based strategic framework tool called Theory of Change. Now, Theory of Change is very important and very, very widely used within the international development sector. Now, Theory of Change is a valuable tool to understand the impact of policies, interventions, programs. Now, these are measures which are connected to understand the outcome linked to these measures. Theory of Change is today ubiquitous within the international development sector, which talked about. It's used to analyze, plan, and implement long-term change through backwards mapping of interventions. A theory of change technique, which is also program logic, can be implemented in any organization or within our lives to bring about a more holistic for the better. Dr. Helene, thanks a lot for taking out time for a fabulous chat about your work.
I'm always excited to talk about social impact and how to do it better and smarter. So I appreciate the invitation.
Thanks a lot. And this is very interesting because theory of change, you've been at the forefront of the theory of change framework. So it's going to be very exciting to understand the whole part, and thanks for joining. So it's been it's lovely to have you, for a conversation. You already mentioned you're a leading authority. When we talk about theory of change, now it was, of course, also made famous by Aspen Roundtable for Community Change. And Acknowledge was one of the major, played a fundamental role within this segment. So when we start before, and we talk about how the whole process came in, through the multi-stakeholder community-driven outcome, which you have implemented, and you could take us, right through the early 90s. But before, for my audience, we'll just come first in your own terms. You tell us what does interventions mean, and we'll also elaborate on the definition of strategy.
So would you like me to begin on describing interventions?
Yeah, interventions and strategy, and then you can, take us through every whole part of how the theory of change.
And then go back to the history. Okay.
Or you could do anytime. You could go with the history and then, you can talk. It's totally up to you.
Well, I'll answer your question on interventions, which are a very fundamental part of TOC, and then we can move into the telling the whole story. It's a good question. We use interventions, and we don't want people to get hung up on terminology. When we teach and implement theory of change, we use interventions to represent anything from very specific activities up through broad strategies, depending on how the group defines it. And I'll say what each of those mean. So to us, and this is just to us, people can adopt the language they agree on. To us, an intervention is anything that you, the creators of the people desiring the long-term outcome and creating the theory of change, anything that you have to do to bring about an outcome is an intervention. And an intervention is not at the fine level of every single activity that it takes, but nor is it as grand as a strategy, which explains more about why the intervention will work. So let me give an example. In an education program where the long-term goal is for all students to graduate high school or college, ultimately to lead productive lives with good jobs, One of the interventions to students doing better academically may be an after-school program. So we would call that an intervention. The school needs to develop an after-school program. An activity could be defined as all of the things it takes to develop an after-school program. You need to identify the curriculum that will help bring students up to their best level. You need to have teachers in place. You need rooms to give the class in. You need parental permission. So all of those activities together, you probably don't want to list in your theory of change. You want to wait until you've moved it over into a theory of action and a work plan. So it's good enough in the theory of change to say the intervention is the after-school program, and wait to develop the work plan on every single activity it takes to develop the after-school program until you're developing a work plan. Is that part clear so far?
Yes, ma'am.
And then to move on to strategy, strategy is all, now people that we work with use strategy to mean so many different things, but in the context of how does it differ from an intervention as we use it, a strategy would be explaining why the intervention is actually a strategic intervention designed to lead to an outcome. So if the intervention is an after-school program, the overall statement of the strategy might be providing students with the tutoring and out-of-school time support that they need in order to improve their grades and test scores. So the strategy is a fuller statement of we're doing this in order to bring about that. And often people will talk about their overall strategy. Their overall strategy might be to do everything through the lens of diversity and inclusion. So people talk about strategy as something broader than a specific intervention. A specific intervention is a set of activities that you need to take to bring about an outcome. And the activities are the very fine-tuned, every task needed. So that's how we use it. But I don't want people to feel these are rigid. People use them in their own organization in different ways. And as long as it's understood within everybody working together, it's fine.
That's
how we differentiate them.
I got it. That's a very good example. Take us through the history now. I mean,
how
it came in through the 90s, the collaborations with Aspen.
What about how to try to put this in a nutshell for people? Because, this is my lived history over the last 25 years, and I can probably spend just as long explaining it. So I'm going to try to condense that into the key points. The Aspen Roundtable on Community Initiatives first began disseminating theory of change in the 1990s. The Aspen Roundtable was a think tank. They didn't go do work in the field very much. They were funded by Annie E. Casey Foundation for several years to disseminate the concepts of theory of change. And they did a 3-volume set of books called Voices from the Field, which are still very foundational and important in understanding basic theory of change concepts and why theory of change was necessary in complex social initiatives. They didn't invent theory of change, but they really disseminated it and tailored it to social initiatives. It goes back to being based on Kurt Lewin's theory of action, which we won't go into, but it has historical roots in people being participatory and acting on their own environments and being agents of change, and there being spirals of learning as you do that. So Aspen really defined and disseminated theory of change. And I, coincidentally to them doing all of that, I was beginning to realize in my own work that if I was going to be being a good evaluator, I needed to understand what people thought they were doing rather than just test